If you don't think you like Gunpowder Fantasy, I hope you'll stick around because maybe, just maybe, you might change your mind by the end of the video. I know I had the knee-jerk reaction of saying, no way to Gunpowder Fantasy when I first saw one of the covers. Who am I? I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen who is the speculative detective investigating all things in fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And go ahead and call me Ms. Daisy if you're nasty. So what is Gunpowder Fantasy? It may shock you that there is no official committee on genres that gives authoritative definitions on what a particular subgenre is. Keep in mind, the whole point of genres and subgenres is simply to help a reader find similar books. Oh, I really loved the Monk and Robot books. I see it's tagged solarpunk. I'll look for other books tagged solarpunk because I want to find more books with the same theme or world building or whatever. Gunpowder Fantasy generally means a fantasy novel that has flintlock guns, or roughly the technology level of around the Revolutionary War or Napoleonic War. I've also heard the term magic and muskets, which is a play on sword and sorcery, but it's commonly called flintlock fantasies because flintlock clearly establishes the technology level. Personally, I think Gunpowder Fantasy is what most people call it because it's so closely associated with the Powder Mage series by Brian McClellan, which I would argue really established the genre. But Flintlock Fantasy may be more accurate, because if we're talking about just any fantasy with guns, then would encapsulate Fond du Livre's Jade Wars, which has guns, and the guns play an important role in some of the plot points, but I don't think most people would categorize it as gunpowder technology since the technology is based in the mid-20th century. Oh, I just said something important. Flintlock Fantasy or Gunpowder Fantasy, of course, has to have guns, duh, but the guns have to play a part in the plot or the story. They can't just be window dressing. And maybe you've read a Flintlock Fantasy story without realizing it. J.R.R. Tolkien's Farmer Giles of Ham is, yes, a fantasy, children's fantasy, about a farmer and a dragon and a stupid king, but the farmer has a blunderbuss, which is a type of musket that plays rather an important part of the story. What about Leigh Bardugo's Grishaverse? Have you read any of the Shadow and Bone or Six of Crows novels? Then you know guns are a major part of the story because there are armies that equip their soldiers with guns, and those armies shape the world. Yes, there is plenty of magic too, but heck, wasn't Jesper of Six of Crows such a good sharpshooter because of his magic? What about Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell? Or The Poppy Wars by R.F. Kuang? My first Flintlock fantasy was Naomi Novik's debut novel, His Majesty's Dragon, published in 2006, which is a what if during the Napoleonic Wars, dragons were real and used as weapons of war along with guns and cannons. This is what I consider a popcorn read because the book is so light and funny and fast-paced and addictive, you just can't help devour the book like eating popcorn. The premise presents a world where dragons exist and dragons bond with one human for life or until the human dies, and the dragon usually bonds with their offspring. Think Dragon Riders of Pern. Anyway, in such a world, wooden dragons become an integral part of the social fabric, especially the military. The story is about a rare dragon egg on its way to be bonded with Napoleon, but it's intercepted by British forces, and one of the British captains accidentally bonds with the egg. Now, Dragons have evolved differently depending on their geographic region in the world, and this is a new powerful black dragon. And it's a mystery because no one has seen its type before. The dragon's name is Temeraire, born during the Napoleonic Wars with guns and cannons and all the trials and tribulations of war. And the dragon is fortunate to be bonded with Captain Lawrence, who happens to be a man of honor. Anyway, Naomi Novik's first novel was nominated for a Hugo and a bunch of other awards, and started a series that spans 9 novels. I'll be honest, after the first 3 novels, which I think makes a very solid trilogy, the stories start feeling a little repetitive, but I thought it was worth going through because the last book, League of Dragons, brings the series to a nice, satisfying conclusion. But we can't talk about Flintlock Fantasy without talking about Brian McClellan's Powder Mage series. The first book, Promise of Blood, was published in 2013. Nobody thought this book would take off because the cover showed a guy in what looked like a Revolutionary War uniform holding a gun. And this is supposed to be an epic fantasy? Where are the elves? Where are the orcs? In fact, even the publisher didn't have high hopes for the book. The popular consensus at that time was that fantasy fans want swords, not guns. They want their settings in the medieval period with elves and orcs. They'd never pick up what looks like a military fantasy with guns. And I was the same way. I saw the cover and thought, that's not for me. But finally, for whatever reason, I picked it up and I loved it. What if I told you the novel takes place after a revolution and it's a story about how an army commander must figure out how to keep civilization together and navigate politics even though he's a man of war? Or what if I told you the story was a mystery about a private investigator in the mold of Sam Spade hired to track down the meaning behind a phrase uttered by the old overthrown regime? What if I told you it was a story about a prodigal son whose relationship with his father is complicated? Or what if I told you it was a story about how mortals must navigate a world where gods are real and capricious? Do you see what I'm getting at? The preconceptions based on just the words Flintlock Fantasy or Gunpowder Fantasy are just making conclusions looking at the covers, which is ironic for me to say, but sometimes it really doesn't do justice to how really great the book is. Not to mention how well this one is written on a prose level. So what is a powder mage? Why do I say this is a series that establishes gunpowder fantasy as a genre? In this world where some people are born with an innate magic power, which can range from small knacks like having a eidetic memory all the way up to Merlin-type wizards, one such type of magic user are people who are able to eat or snort or otherwise absorb gunpowder into their bodies, which heightens their senses and lets them sense where gunpowder is all around them, and even detonating that gunpowder, which makes these powder mages somewhat useful weapons in wars where guns are involved. It's a unique magic system integral to the world building and the plot, which really rounds the story out and makes it one of my favorite fantasy series. The second series in this world is called Gods of Blood and Powder, and that one is really good as well. In both these series, I also really enjoyed how the author, McClellan, treated men and women. Basically, there wasn't any difference in the roles or personalities between the genders. They were just people. In fact, I got, especially in the second series, I got the impression that he was almost flipping a coin to decide on what gender of any character, whether they're a leader of a mercenary company or a cook at an inn, whatever. If you love epic fantasy, I really urge you to give Powder Mage a chance. It's so much more than what you may think it is, especially if you're just looking at the cover. Now, the Powder Mage was an unexpected success, so it should come as no surprise that it inspired a whole lot of other Gunpowder or Flintlock fantasies. I really think this is a series that established the subgenre in people's minds, even though there were, of course, other fantasy books with flintlock guns before that. But afterwards, we saw Adrian Tchaikovsky's Guns of Dawn, Jim Butcher's Cinder Spire series, Kingdom of Liars by Nick Martell, the Spellslinger series by Sebastian de Castell. Heck, I just picked up for Shove It or Shove It C.L. Clarke's books, The Unbroken and the Faithless, which could be considered Flintlock or Gunpowder Fantasy. Now, many of the books mentioned could fall into several other subgenres. Again, think of subgenres like tags, where a book can have many different tags. Her Majesty's Dragon, for example, is often cited as historical fantasy because of how it follows the Napoleonic Wars. Subgenres and genres aren't exclusive or conclusive, so maybe, just maybe, there are Gunpowder Fantasy books out there that you may enjoy, not because of the guns, but because they're just great stories, no matter what genres they've been tagged with. If there are any other speculative fiction genres you'd like me to cover, let me know down in the comments, and while you're there, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.